In the 1960s, a simple day was often enough. Many of us remember waking without haste, not because time was abundant, but because it was understood differently. Morning arrived quietly, announced by light entering through curtains that had been drawn the night before, by familiar sounds in the street, by the presence of others already awake and moving about their routines. There was no sense of urgency to begin recording the day or preparing it for display. The day simply began, and that was sufficient. We remember how the rhythm of life seemed slower, though at the time it did not feel slow at all. It felt complete. The hours unfolded with a natural order that required little explanation. Tasks were repeated not because they were scheduled, but because they belonged there. Breakfast was prepared in much the same way each morning, not as an act of efficiency, but as a continuation of habit. The same cups, the same table, the same gestures. These repetitions were not dull. They were reassuring. They told us where we were and who we were with. In those days, a great deal was learned without being spoken. Children observed before they understood, and understanding came not through instruction, but through familiarity. We watched how adults moved through their responsibilities, how they greeted neighbors, how they handled objects with care, because those objects were meant to last. Nothing appeared disposable, not because people spoke of conservation, but because replacement was neither immediate nor expected. What one had was used well, repaired when necessary, and respected quietly. The home itself carried a sense of purpose. Rooms were used for living, not for display. Furniture bore marks of time and use, and those marks were accepted as part of its character. There was little emphasis on constant change. A chair remained where it had always been, and in that constancy, it became more than furniture. It became a reference point, something the body recognized instinctively. To sit, there was to return to a known position in the world. Outside, the neighborhood functioned as an extension of the home. Doors were not always locked during the day, not because danger was unknown, but because trust was common. People knew one another by sight, by name, by routine. Encounters were frequent and unplanned. A brief exchange at the gate or on the sidewalk carried more meaning than many longer conversations do today. There was no need to explain oneself fully. Much was already understood. Work, for many, was not separated sharply from life. It occupied a portion of the day, but rarely its entirety. There was a clear sense of beginning and ending. When the workday concluded, it released its hold. Evenings belonged to family, to rest, to quiet activities that required presence rather than performance. The idea of being constantly reachable had not yet formed. Absence was natural, and silence was not alarming. Meals were moments of gathering rather than interruption. They marked time gently, structuring the day without rigid control. To sit together was not a planned event. It was simply what one did. Conversation flowed slowly, often punctuated by pauses that felt comfortable rather than awkward. Silence was allowed to exist alongside speech. No one felt compelled to fill every moment with sound. Entertainment did not demand constant attention. A radio might play softly in the background, offering music or voices that blended into the atmosphere rather than dominating it. Television, when present, was approached with restraint. Programs had fixed times, and missing one was accepted without distress. There was no expectation of immediate access to everything. Waiting was a familiar experience, and patience was practiced without being named. In those years, time seemed to stretch not because days were longer, but because they were less crowded. One activity followed another with space between them. Walking was common, not as exercise, but as transportation and habit. The act of moving through the streets allowed for observation, for noticing small changes, for greeting familiar faces. Distance was measured not only in length, but in experience. Clothing reflected the same practicality. Garments were chosen for durability and appropriateness rather than novelty. They were mended when worn, passed down when outgrown, and rarely discarded without reason. Appearance mattered, but not as a form of display. It was an expression of respect for oneself and for others, quietly maintained. We recall how values were absorbed through repetition. Courtesy was learned by watching it practiced. Responsibility was demonstrated rather than explained. One did not speak often about principles, but one lived among them. The steady presence of routine created a framework within which individuals found their place. There was little discussion about identity. It emerged naturally through participation in shared life. Communication moved at a human pace. Letters were written by hand, composed thoughtfully, and sent with the understanding that replies would take time. That time was not considered empty. Anticipation was part of the exchange. The arrival of a letter carried weight because it represented effort and intention. Words were chosen carefully, knowing they could not be revised once sent. The pace of change itself was slower. Innovations arrived gradually, allowing people to adapt without feeling displaced. When something new entered daily life, it did not immediately replace what came before. Old and new coexisted for a time, and choices were made deliberately. Progress was observed rather than chased. In social gatherings, presence mattered more than presentation. People arrived as they were, carrying their experiences into shared spaces without the need to curate them. Stories were told more than once, not because they were forgotten, but because repetition strengthened connection. Listening was an active process, guided by familiarity and respect. Children spent long hours outdoors, not under supervision in the modern sense, but within a network of shared awareness. Many eyes noticed, even if no one was watching closely. Play unfolded without constant direction, allowing imagination to grow from available materials and surroundings. Simplicity encouraged creativity rather than limiting it. Evenings settled gently. As daylight faded, activities naturally slowed. There was a sense of closure to the day that did not require deliberate effort. Lamps were turned on, conversations softened, and the pace adjusted to the coming night. Sleep was approached as a necessity rather than postponed as an inconvenience. Looking back, we do not claim that life was easier in every respect. Difficulties existed, and not all experiences were gentle. Yet there was a prevailing sense that a single day, lived fully within its limits, was enough. Completion did not require accumulation. Satisfaction came from participation rather than achievement. Over the years, memory has softened the edges of that time, but has preserved its essence. What remains is not a list of events, but a feeling of balance, a sense that life moved forward without constant acceleration, that days were shaped by needs rather than demands. This memory does not call us backward, but it reminds us of another way of being. As we reflect on those years, we recognize how much was carried forward quietly. Habits formed then continued long after circumstances changed. The ability to wait, to observe, to accept limits did not disappear entirely. It remained present in gestures, in preferences, in the way many of us still approach time itself. The contrast of today emerges naturally, without the need for judgment. The world has expanded, offered more connections, more information, more choices. Yet alongside this expansion, the simplicity of a complete day has become harder to recognize. The feeling that one has done enough, simply by living through the hours attentively, is less common. Still, the memory endures. It lives not as a standard to be measured against the present, but as a reference point. It reminds us that fulfillment once required less accumulation and more attention, that a day did not need to be optimized to be meaningful, that routine, far from limiting life, often gave it shape. In recalling the 1960s, we are not searching for perfection. We are acknowledging a shared experience of time that felt generous, even when resources were limited. We remember how enough was often truly enough, and how that understanding shaped the way days were lived, one after another, with quiet confidence. As we move further into that remembered time, we begin to notice how ordinary moments carried a weight that was never announced. A day did not need to contain something exceptional to be remembered as full. The simple fact of continuity, of knowing what would likely happen next, provided a quiet comfort. One woke with an implicit understanding of the day's shape, not because it was rigidly planned, but because it followed a familiar order that rarely betrayed expectations. Much of life unfolded within a narrow geographic radius. Workplaces, schools, shops, and homes were often close enough to reach on foot or by short journeys. This closeness created a sense of belonging that was reinforced daily. Streets were known not by their names alone, but by their details: the uneven pavement, the tree that offered shade in the afternoon, the window where someone always seemed to be watching. These details formed a mental map that required no effort to maintain. Shops were modest and purposeful. One entered them not to browse endlessly, but to acquire what was needed. The shopkeeper was often a familiar figure, someone whose presence anchored the space. Exchanges were brief and respectful. There was little persuasion involved, little urgency to buy more than intended. The act of purchase was simply one small step in the continuation of the day. Money itself was approached with a certain gravity. It was not discussed lightly, nor was it hidden entirely. Children learned its value not through abstract explanation, but through observation. They saw how carefully it was handled, how decisions were weighed, how unnecessary spending was avoided without resentment. This carefulness did not feel restrictive. It felt responsible. It shaped attitude that extended beyond finances into other areas of life. Leisure existed, but it was not sharply distinguished from work. Moments of rest were woven naturally into the day. Sitting quietly after a meal, standing at the doorway watching the street, listening without interruption to the sounds of the neighborhood. These were not labeled as relaxation. They were simply pauses, accepted as part of the rhythm of living. Conversation, too, followed its own pace. People spoke deliberately, often choosing their words with care. Interruptions were rare, not because rules were enforced, but because listening was valued. To allow another to finish speaking was a sign of respect. Quietly understood. Disagreements occurred, but they were usually expressed with restraint. Voices seldom rose without reason. In family life, roles were clearly defined, yet flexible enough to adapt when necessary. Responsibilities were assumed early, often without formal assignment. One helped because help was needed, not because it was requested. This sense of contribution fostered a quiet confidence. Each person knew that their presence mattered, even if it was rarely acknowledged explicitly. The passage of seasons was felt deeply. Changes in weather altered daily routines in noticeable ways. Clothing adjusted, meals shifted, activities moved indoors or outdoors accordingly. These changes were accepted without complaint, as natural variations rather than inconveniences. Seasonal rhythms reminded everyone that life was not static, but gently cyclical. Holidays and special occasions stood apart precisely because they were rare. Preparation began well in advance, not as a source of stress, but as a shared effort. Decorations were modest, often reused year after year. Their familiarity enhanced their meaning. Celebration was marked not by excess, but by togetherness and a slight departure from the ordinary. Photographs were taken sparingly. Each image was considered before the shutter was pressed. There was no immediate feedback, no opportunity to review or discard. This uncertainty encouraged care. When photographs were eventually developed, they were handled thoughtfully, stored in albums, revisited over time. Each image carried a sense of intention. News traveled slowly, allowing space for reflection. Information arrived through newspapers, radio broadcasts, or word of mouth. The delay between event and awareness softened reactions. People absorbed developments gradually, often discussing them with others before forming conclusions. This process fostered a collective understanding that felt shared rather than imposed. Education emphasized patience and repetition. Learning unfolded over time, reinforced by routine. Mastery was not expected instantly. Mistakes were corrected quietly, without public embarrassment. Progress was measured internally, through growing competence rather than constant evaluation. The goal was understanding, not performance. There was an unspoken respect for boundaries. One did not intrude without reason, nor did one expect constant availability from others. Visits were announced. Letters preceded arrivals, and privacy was assumed rather than demanded. This respect created a sense of security that permeated daily life. Even boredom had its place. Moments without stimulation were not immediately filled. They invited observation, imagination, and rest. Children learned to occupy themselves with whatever was at hand. Adults allowed their thoughts to wander without feeling the need to justify the time spent doing so. These quiet intervals were not wasted. They were restorative. Tools and objects were maintained carefully. Repair was a common skill, not a specialized service. Knowing how to fix something was a source of pride, quietly acknowledged. This knowledge fostered independence and respect for materials. Objects were seen as companions in daily life, not as temporary conveniences. Transportation reflected this same measured approach. Journeys were planned with consideration, and delays were accepted as part of the experience. Travel did not aim to eliminate distance, but to navigate it thoughtfully. The act of moving from one place to another carried its own significance. In public spaces, behavior was guided by mutual awareness. People adjusted their actions in response to others without being prompted. Courtesy was practiced instinctively. Small gestures, holding a door, offering assistance, waiting one's turn, were performed without comment. They were part of a shared understanding of how one moved through the world. As days passed, they accumulated not as a blur, but as a sequence of familiar patterns. Memory retained their structure even when specific details faded. What remained was a sense of coherence, a feeling that life unfolded in a way that could be followed and understood. Looking back now, we recognize that much of this clarity came from limits. Fewer choices meant fewer decisions. Fewer distractions allowed deeper attention. These limits were not experienced as deprivation, but as boundaries that shaped experience gently. Over time, these habits formed a quiet foundation. They influenced how many of us approach change later in life. Even as circumstances evolved, the memory of a simpler rhythm persisted, offering a reference for balance. We do not recall these days as perfect, but as sufficient. They did not promise fulfillment through accumulation, but through participation. Each day offered enough opportunity to engage, to contribute, to rest. As we continue to reflect, it becomes clear that what we miss is not the past itself, but the feeling that a day could stand on its own, that living within its natural limits was not only possible, but satisfying. This understanding remains with us, quietly informing our sense of time, even as the world around us continues to change. As memory carries us further along, we begin to sense how deeply continuity shaped daily life. Days were not isolated units competing for attention, but parts of an ongoing flow. One day resembled the next closely enough that life felt steady, yet not so closely that it felt stagnant. Small variations mattered. A change in weather, an unexpected visit, a delayed errand. These subtle shifts were enough to give each day its own quiet identity. Morning routines set the tone without demanding focus. Waking, washing, dressing, and preparing to leave the house were acts performed almost unconsciously. There was comfort in this lack of deliberation. One did not need to decide who to be each morning. Identity was stable, carried forward from the day before. The mirror reflected a familiar presence, not a version to be adjusted or refined. The pace of speech itself reflected this stability. Words were not rushed. Silence was not feared. Pauses occurred naturally, allowing thoughts to settle before being expressed. In conversation, there was time to consider, to adjust, to listen. This rhythm encouraged understanding rather than reaction. Meaning emerged gradually, shaped by context as much as by words. Much of what guided behavior was never written or stated. Social norms were absorbed through observation. One learned when to speak and when to wait, when to offer help and when to step back. These judgments were subtle, refined over time by watching others navigate similar situations. Mistakes were corrected gently, often without explicit comment. The physical environment reinforced this sense of moderation. Homes were sized according to need rather than aspiration. Rooms served clear purposes, and space was used thoughtfully. There was little emphasis on maximizing potential or optimizing layouts. What existed was enough, and that was accepted without comparison. Objects within the home carried stories through use. A table bore the marks of countless meals. A cupboard door closed imperfectly, adjusted long ago and never fixed again. These imperfections were not flaws to be corrected, but signs of familiarity. They reminded inhabitants of time passing gently, leaving traces rather than erasing what came before. Time itself was perceived through experience rather than measurement. Clocks were present, but they did not dominate awareness. Schedules existed, but they allowed for flexibility. Being late was inconvenient, not catastrophic. Waiting was expected, not resented. These attitudes softened daily interactions, allowing space for the unexpected. The act of waiting was woven into life seamlessly. Waiting for a bus, for a letter, for a meal to finish cooking. These moments were not filled with alternative tasks. They were simply endured and often enjoyed. Waiting allowed observation. It encouraged reflection. It reminded one that not everything responded immediately to effort. Children, in particular, learned patience through necessity. Entertainment was not instantly available, and boredom was met with creativity rather than avoidance. Simple materials became tools for imagination. Outdoor spaces transformed into worlds defined by shared rules and spontaneous invention. Through this, resilience and adaptability developed quietly. Adults, too, accepted moments of idleness without guilt. Rest was not framed as recovery from productivity, but as part of living well. Sitting quietly, reading slowly, or simply observing the world did not require justification. These pauses replenished attention naturally. Work carried its own rhythm. Tasks were completed sequentially, not simultaneously. One finished one thing before beginning another. Multitasking was rare, not because it was discouraged, but because it was unnecessary. Focus was valued, and distraction was limited by circumstance rather than effort. Pride in work came from doing it well, not from doing it quickly. Craftsmanship mattered, even in ordinary tasks. Care was visible in outcomes, though it was seldom praised aloud. Satisfaction came from knowing something had been done properly, even if no one commented on it. Social roles were reinforced through consistency rather than enforcement. People knew what was expected of them because expectations rarely changed. This predictability created trust. One could rely on others to behave in familiar ways, reducing anxiety and negotiation. The passage of years was marked subtly. There was less emphasis on milestones and more on continuity. Growth was observed gradually, often in retrospect rather than in anticipation. Change was acknowledged when it became undeniable, not when it was announced. Celebrations reflected the same restraint. They were meaningful precisely because they were infrequent. Anticipation built slowly, and preparation involved many hands. The event itself unfolded without urgency. Its value lay in shared presence rather than spectacle. Memory formed differently in this environment. Without constant documentation, experiences were held internally. Recollection depended on feeling rather than image. Memories faded unevenly, preserving impressions rather than details. This allowed them to integrate more fully into one's sense of self. Losses, too, were absorbed gradually. Difficult moments were not immediately analyzed or shared widely. Grief was private, expressed through altered routines and quieter behavior. Support arrived through presence rather than explanation. Words were offered sparingly, often after time had passed. The world beyond one's immediate surroundings felt distant, yet not irrelevant. News connected people to broader events, but did not overwhelm daily concerns. Global developments were considered thoughtfully, discussed calmly, and then set aside as life continued locally. This balance between awareness and distance allowed individuals to remain grounded. The scale of one's responsibilities felt manageable. One could care deeply without feeling consumed. Attention was distributed naturally, guided by proximity and relevance. Over time, these patterns formed a collective sense of proportion. Life contained difficulty and joy, effort and rest, change and stability. None dominated entirely. This balance did not require constant maintenance. It emerged from shared habits practiced over generations. As we reflect now, we see how these habits shape perception itself. Time felt tangible, shaped by experience rather than urgency. Days were not measured by output, but by participation. One felt present within them, rather than chased by them. This presence created a quiet confidence. One trusted that tomorrow would arrive, much like today had. Uncertainty existed, but it was tempered by familiarity. The future was not a constant concern, but a gradual extension of the present. In remembering this, we do not deny the complexities that existed. Challenges were real, and progress was uneven. Yet there was a prevailing sense that life could be lived attentively, without constant acceleration. That understanding continues to resonate. It reminds us that simplicity is not the absence of activity, but the presence of coherence, that a day can be full without being crowded, that living within limits can feel expansive rather than restrictive. As these memories settle, they offer not a prescription, but a perspective. They show us that another rhythm once existed, shaped by patience, repetition, and shared understanding. And though the world has changed, the memory of that rhythm remains, quietly influencing how many of us still sense the passage of time and the meaning of a day. As the recollection deepens, we begin to notice how much of daily life was guided by an unspoken acceptance of limits. Limits of time, of space, of energy. These limits were not viewed as obstacles to overcome, but as boundaries within which life unfolded naturally. One did not attempt to compress the day, to fit more into it. Instead, the day shaped what could reasonably be done, and that shape was respected. Mornings led into afternoons without sharp division. The passage from one part of the day to another was marked more by light than by clocks. Sunlight shifted across rooms, altering their atmosphere subtly. A room that felt bright and open in the morning became quieter and more contained by late afternoon. These changes guided behavior gently, encouraging movement or rest without instruction. Meals continued to act as anchors. They were moments of return, when the day paused long enough for reflection, even if no one spoke of it in those terms. Preparing food required attention, but not haste. Recipes were known by heart, adjusted instinctively rather than measured precisely. Cooking was not a performance, but a continuation of care. The act of eating together reinforced a sense of shared time. Everyone arrived at the table carrying their portion of the day, setting it down briefly to join a collective moment. Conversations reflected this transition. They often began with simple observations and moved slowly toward deeper topics, or ended quietly without conclusion. There was no pressure to resolve every thought. In these gatherings, age differences mattered less than shared presence. Younger and older generations occupied the same space without segmentation. Learning occurred naturally through proximity. Children absorbed language, behavior, and values simply by being there. Elders offered guidance indirectly, through example rather than instruction. The role of elders held a particular dignity. Experience was valued not as authority, but as perspective. Advice, when offered, was measured and contextual. It acknowledged uncertainty and respected individual judgment. Wisdom was not proclaimed. It was demonstrated over time through consistent behavior. Daily responsibilities were distributed according to ability rather than preference. One did what needed to be done, trusting that others would do the same. This mutual reliance created a sense of fairness that did not depend on constant negotiation. Trust replaced oversight, and accountability emerged organically. The physical act of working engaged the body fully. Even tasks that were repetitive required presence. Hands learned patterns, movements became efficient through familiarity. This physical engagement grounded attention, connecting effort to outcome in a direct way. One could see the result of work clearly, often immediately. Fatigue was acknowledged without guilt. When energy waned, rest followed naturally. There was little glorification of exhaustion. To be tired was simply a signal to pause. This responsiveness to bodily cues preserved balance and prevented overextension. Leisure activities reflected similar moderation. Reading was common, but it was not hurried. Pages were turned slowly, passages reread when necessary. Books were chosen thoughtfully and often revisited over years. Familiar stories gained depth through repetition, revealing new meaning with each reading. Music accompanied life quietly. It was listened to attentively, often in stillness. Records were played from beginning to end, without interruption. The act of listening demanded patience, rewarding it with immersion. Music filled space without competing for attention. Silence was present and accepted. It existed between words, between activities, between days. Silence was not emptiness. It was a form of presence. It allowed thoughts to settle and emotions to find their own shape. In silence, one could sense continuity. The pace of correspondence reinforced this calm. Writing a letter involved intention and time. One considered what to say, how to say it, and whether it needed to be said at all. The physical act of writing slowed thought, encouraging clarity. Sending the letter released it from immediate control, allowing space for patience. Receiving a reply carried its own quiet ceremony. Opening an envelope, unfolding paper, recognizing handwriting. These acts grounded communication in the physical world. They reminded one that connection required effort and time, and that both were worth giving. Public institutions operated with similar deliberation. Services moved at a human pace. Waiting rooms were spaces of shared patience rather than frustration. People accepted delays as part of collective functioning. Complaints were rare, not because standards were low, but because expectations were realistic. The sense of belonging extended beyond family and neighborhood to a broader civic identity. Participation in communal life was expected, though not enforced. One attended local events, contributed when able, and respected shared spaces. This participation reinforced connection without demanding constant engagement. Change, when it arrived, was absorbed gradually. New technologies or practices entered life slowly, allowing time for adaptation. People observed before adopting. Skepticism existed, but it was tempered by curiosity. Decisions were made cautiously, with consideration for how change would alter daily routines. This gradual integration preserved continuity. Life did not feel fragmented by sudden shifts. Instead, it evolved organically, carrying familiar elements forward even as new ones appeared. This continuity supported emotional stability, reducing the sense of displacement. The memory of this stability persists not because it was flawless, but because it offered coherence. Life made sense within its limits. One understood where one stood in relation to others, to work, to time itself. This understanding reduced anxiety and fostered contentment. As years passed, individuals carried these patterns with them, even as circumstances changed. The habits formed in quieter times influenced responses to busier ones. The ability to pause, to wait, to accept imperfection remained available even when challenged. Looking back, we recognize that this way of living did not require constant self-awareness. People were not preoccupied with how they felt about each moment. They lived through experiences directly, reflecting later if at all. This immediacy grounded them in the present without naming it. The absence of constant self-examination allowed for a certain ease. One acted, responded, adjusted, and moved on. Emotions were acknowledged through behavior rather than analysis. Joy was expressed through shared moments. Disappointment was absorbed quietly, often softened by routine. This approach did not eliminate hardship, but it provided tools to endure it. Familiar structures offered support during difficult times. One knew what to do next, even when the larger picture was uncertain. Routine provided stability when emotion wavered. As we continue to reflect, we see how these elements combined to create days that felt complete, not because they contained everything, but because they contained enough. Enough work, enough rest, enough connection. Balance emerged not from careful planning, but from lived experience. The memory of such days does not ask us to recreate them exactly. It reminds us that fulfillment once arose from alignment rather than accumulation, that living attentively within limits could produce a sense of wholeness that required little explanation. This understanding lingers quietly, offering perspective without insistence. It suggests that simplicity is not a loss, but a different arrangement of priorities, that a day shaped by natural rhythms can still be sufficient, even in a changing world. And so the recollection continues, not as a longing for return, but as an acknowledgement of a shared inheritance, a way of moving through time that valued presence, patience, and continuity, a reminder that a single day, when lived with attention and restraint, could stand complete on its own. As we dwell longer within this remembered landscape, the sense of continuity becomes more pronounced. Days did not press against one another, competing for importance. Instead, they flowed, each contributing quietly to a larger pattern. One did not wake with the feeling of having fallen behind. There was an underlying confidence that life progressed at a pace that could be met without strain. This confidence was reinforced by the predictability of surroundings. Familiar paths were walked repeatedly, not out of limitation, but out of comfort. Knowing where one was going and how long it would take to get there removed a layer of uncertainty from daily life. Movement through space was unhurried because it was understood. There was no need to calculate every minute. The presence of others was constant but not intrusive. People shared spaces naturally, without the need for constant coordination. Encounters happened organically. A brief conversation on the street, a shared glance of recognition, a simple greeting exchanged without expectation of continuation. These small interactions affirmed belonging without demanding energy. Privacy coexisted easily with community. One could be alone without feeling isolated, and among others without feeling exposed. Boundaries were respected intuitively. Silence was not interpreted as absence, and presence did not require performance. This balance allowed individuals to remain themselves within a shared environment. Time spent alone was valued quietly. Solitude was not framed as withdrawal, but as a natural state. Reading, thinking, repairing something by hand, or simply observing the world from a familiar place. These solitary activities contributed to well-being without needing justification. They offered space for thought to unfold slowly. The passage of time within the home followed subtle cues. A kettle boiling, footsteps on the stairs, a door opening and closing. These sounds marked transitions more gently than alarms or notifications ever could. They signaled activity without urgency, presence without demand. The house itself participated in the rhythm of the day. Household tasks were approached with acceptance. Cleaning, mending, organizing were not seen as interruptions to life, but as part of it. These tasks connected individuals to their environment, reinforcing care and responsibility. Completion brought quiet satisfaction rather than visible reward. There was an understanding that effort had limits. One did what could reasonably be done within the day, and what remained would wait. This acceptance prevented constant tension. The unfinished did not haunt the evening. Night arrived as a natural conclusion, not as a failure to accomplish more. Sleep was approached with respect. It was not postponed unnecessarily, nor treated as negotiable. Rest was recognized as essential, woven into the structure of life. Waking rest was valued more than extending the day artificially. This respect for rest preserved energy across time. Dreams of the future existed, but they were not urgent. Aspirations unfolded gradually, shaped by circumstance rather than driven by pressure. Progress was measured in small steps, often visible only in retrospect. There was patience for growth and acceptance of gradual change. The concept of success was modest. It was defined less by achievement and more by stability, providing for oneself and others, maintaining relationships, fulfilling responsibilities. These were considered sufficient markers of a life lived well. Comparison was limited, reducing dissatisfaction. Mistakes were absorbed into experience without excessive self-criticism. Errors were corrected when possible and remembered as lessons rather than failures. This approach fostered resilience. One learned to continue rather than to dwell. In social settings, participation was voluntary and genuine. Attendance mattered less than presence. Those who came did so fully, without distraction. Shared activities, games, conversations, simple celebrations, unfolded at a pace that allowed everyone to follow. Humor emerged naturally from shared understanding. It relied on context, on familiarity, on timing. Laughter was not forced or amplified. It rose and faded, leaving warmth behind. Joy was experienced as a moment rather than captured as a goal. The relationship with objects reflected care and moderation. Possessions were few enough to be known individually. Each had a place and a purpose. Losing something was noticed immediately, not because it was valuable in itself, but because it was familiar. This familiarity fostered attentiveness. Repair continued to be a quiet skill passed down through observation. Knowing how to fix something created independence and confidence. It also encouraged patience. One learned to work with materials rather than replace them. This approach extended to relationships as well. Disagreements were handled with restraint. Conflict existed, but it rarely escalated. People expected differences and navigated them through conversation and compromise. Resolution was often implicit rather than formal. Life continued, carrying disagreement alongside cooperation. Public behavior reflected shared standards. One adjusted actions instinctively to accommodate others. Courtesy was practiced without comment. This mutual awareness reduced friction and allowed public spaces to function smoothly. The experience of time passing was gentle. Aging was observed gradually, marked by subtle changes rather than sudden transitions. There was respect for those who had lived longer, not as symbols, but as participants in a shared continuum. Their presence connected past and present. Memory itself functioned differently. Without constant recording, it retained impressions rather than exact details. This allowed memories to blend, forming a cohesive sense of life rather than a collection of isolated moments. Meaning emerged from accumulation rather than emphasis. The absence of constant evaluation reduced anxiety. One was not continually assessing whether one was doing enough, being enough, progressing fast enough. Life was lived forward, with reflection occurring occasionally, often prompted by natural pauses. These pauses allowed perspective to form organically. Sitting quietly at the end of the day, one could sense completion without needing to enumerate accomplishments. The day felt whole simply because it had been lived attentively. As we consider this now, we recognize how rare that feeling has become. The sense that a day can be finished without being exhausted. That presence alone can justify the passing of hours. This recognition does not accuse the present. It illuminates a difference. The memory of those days reminds us that fulfillment does not require constant stimulation. That meaning can arise from repetition, from familiarity, from small acts performed with care. That stability can be a source of richness rather than monotony. This understanding does not demand a return. It simply offers a lens through which to view time differently, to see value in what is steady, in what endures, in what unfolds without urgency. As the recollection continues, it deepens rather than concludes. Each remembered element connects to another, forming a network of habits, values, and rhythms. Together, they create a sense of life that was coherent and sufficient. And within that coherence lies a quiet realization that a simple day was once enough, not because life was smaller, but because attention was larger, because time was allowed to be itself, because living did not require constant justification. This realization remains available, even now, carried forward through memory and habit. It reminds us that beneath change and expansion, there exists a timeless rhythm, one that values presence over accumulation, continuity over acceleration. In acknowledging this, we honor not just a decade, but a way of inhabiting time, a way that understood the limits as guides, not constraints, a way that allowed days to stand complete, one after another, without demand for more. And so the reflection moves onward, steady and unhurried, carrying with it the quiet assurance that meaning can be found in simplicity, and that the memory of enough still holds its place within us. As the reflection continues, the notion of time itself becomes more tangible. In those years, time was not something one managed or optimized. It was something one inhabited. It passed through the day in visible and audible ways, marked by shadows lengthening on walls, by the sound of footsteps returning home, by the gradual quieting of the street. These signals required no interpretation. They were understood instinctively, reminding everyone that time moved forward whether it was measured or not. This awareness of time encouraged a different relationship with effort. One did not attempt to outrun the day. Tasks were approached with the understanding that there was an appropriate moment for each. If something could not be finished, it would be resumed later. This acceptance reduced pressure and allowed attention to remain focused on what was immediately present. The absence of constant urgency shaped emotional life as well. Feelings were not required to be resolved immediately. Disappointment, satisfaction, concern, and relief were allowed to coexist without immediate categorization. Emotional responses unfolded gradually, shaped by reflection rather than reaction. This pacing softened extremes and encouraged balance. Social expectations reflected this moderation. One was not expected to be constantly improving or reinventing oneself. Personal change occurred, but it was integrated slowly into existing patterns. Growth did not demand visible transformation. It was recognized through increased confidence, deeper understanding, and steadier judgment. Daily communication reinforced this steadiness. Conversations often revisited familiar topics, not because there was nothing new to say, but because shared reference points created connection. Repetition strengthened bonds. It allowed people to confirm understanding and reaffirm shared values without needing novelty. Listening carried its own quiet discipline. To listen well required patience and presence. One did not prepare a response, while another spoke. Attention was given fully, allowing meaning to emerge. This practice fostered mutual respect and reduced misunderstanding. In public life, events were anticipated rather than instantly accessed. Announcements were made in advance, allowing people to plan without haste. Attendance involved commitment, not spontaneous decision. This anticipation heightened engagement. One arrived prepared, both practically and mentally. The sense of preparation extended to everyday activities. Leaving the house involved checking belongings carefully. Forgotten items require return, not replacement. This habit cultivated mindfulness. One became accustomed to considering needs before acting, reducing waste and distraction. Physical surroundings reinforced this attentiveness. Streets and buildings changed slowly, allowing familiarity to deepen. Renovations were noticeable because they were infrequent. When something changed, it altered the landscape meaningfully, becoming a point of reference rather than background noise. This stability supported memory. Places accumulated significance through repeated experience. A corner where people often stopped to talk, a bench used for resting, a doorway associated with arrival. These locations held meaning beyond their function. They anchored memory spatially, providing continuity across years. The relationship between individuals and their environment was reciprocal. Care was given to spaces because they were shared and enduring. Littering was rare, not because it was heavily penalized, but because it disrupted a collective sense of order. Responsibility for the environment was assumed rather than assigned. Weather influenced mood and behavior more directly. Rain altered plans without causing frustration. Cold encouraged closeness. Heat slowed movement. These influences were accepted as part of life's variability rather than obstacles to be eliminated. Adaptation replaced resistance. This adaptability extended to social arrangements. Plans were flexible enough to accommodate change. A delayed arrival or altered schedule did not provoke irritation. People adjusted expectations readily, prioritizing presence over precision. Even conflict benefited from this flexibility. Disagreements unfolded over time, allowing emotions to cool and perspectives to shift. Immediate resolution was not always sought. Distance provided clarity, and solutions emerged gradually. The practice of patience permeated daily life. Waiting did not signify inefficiency. It signified respect for process. Whether waiting for an answer, for assistance, or for one's turn, individuals accepted delay as natural. This acceptance reduced tension and fostered cooperation. Workplaces reflected similar rhythms. Tasks followed established procedures, reducing uncertainty. Innovation occurred, but it was incremental. Change was introduced thoughtfully, allowing workers to adapt without disruption. This continuity supported confidence and competence. Pride in one's role was derived from reliability rather than visibility. Being dependable mattered more than standing out. Contribution was measured by consistency and care. Recognition, when offered, was understated, reinforcing humility rather than competition. The relationship between generations was marked by continuity. Younger individuals learned not only skills but attitudes from observing older ones. Respect flowed both ways. Elders remained engaged in daily life, offering perspective without dominance. Their presence reinforced a sense of lineage and continuity. Rituals, both small and large, contributed to this sense of continuity. Lighting a lamp at dusk, sharing a familiar greeting, following established customs. These actions provided structure without rigidity. They marked transitions gently, grounding experience in shared practice. The absence of constant novelty allowed depth to develop. Familiar activities gained richness through repetition. One noticed subtle variations, deepened understanding, and refined skill. Mastery emerged quietly, without announcement. This depth extended to relationships. Friendships evolved over time, shaped by shared experience rather than constant communication. Long periods without contact did not weaken bonds. Reunion restored connection easily, grounded in shared history. Memory, shaped by these patterns, carried emotional weight differently. It did not catalog moments exhaustively. Instead, it retained atmosphere, tone, and feeling. Recollection was holistic rather than fragmented, preserving a sense of coherence. As we consider this now, we recognize how these elements combine to create resilience. Individuals were supported by routine, by community, by predictable structures. When difficulties arose, these supports mitigated their impact. One was not alone in facing change. This resilience did not eliminate hardship, but it provided tools for endurance. Familiar patterns offered refuge during uncertainty. One could rely on routine when emotion faltered, allowing stability to carry one forward. The concept of enough remained central. Enough work for the day, enough conversation, enough rest. This sense of sufficiency prevented constant striving. It allowed satisfaction to arise naturally, without comparison. As time passed, these habits became ingrained. Even as circumstances evolved, the underlying rhythm persisted. Many carried it within them, influencing how they approached new environments and challenges. The memory of that rhythm remains not as an instruction, but as a quiet reference. It suggests that life need not be crowded to be meaningful, that attention and care can transform ordinary moments into sources of fulfillment. In recalling this, we do not idealize the past. We acknowledge its limitations alongside its strengths. Yet we recognize that its approach to time offered something rare, a sense of presence unburdened by urgency. This presence allowed days to conclude without regret. One could look back on the hours past and feel that they had been lived fully, even if little of note had occurred. Completion was measured by engagement rather than accomplishment. As the reflection continues, it carries this understanding forward. It invites consideration of how time is inhabited, not how it is used. It reminds us that simplicity can coexist with depth, that routine can nurture meaning. The memory of a day being enough endures because it speaks to a fundamental human need, to feel grounded within the flow of time, to live in a way that honors limits without diminishing experience. And so the narrative moves on, steady and reflective, holding this awareness gently. It acknowledges change without resistance, honoring what was while remaining present to what is. In this ongoing reflection, the past does not stand apart. It informs the present subtly, offering perspective without insistence. It suggests that within the complexity of modern life, the essence of sufficient day remains possible, not as a return to another era, but as a remembrance of rhythm that once guided daily life with quiet assurance, a rhythm that valued presence, patience, and continuity, a rhythm that allowed a simple day to stand complete and to be enough. As the reflection carries onward, attention turns naturally to how meaning was constructed through repetition rather than intensity. In those years, importance did not need to announce itself loudly. It emerged slowly through recurrence. What happened often became significant not because it was dramatic, but because it endured. Familiar gestures, repeated over time, gained weight precisely through their constancy. Daily greetings were an example of this quiet accumulation. A nod, a brief word exchange, a shared acknowledgement in passing. These small acts reinforce connection without demanding engagement. Over years, they built familiarity and trust. One knew others not through intimate disclosure, but through presence observed consistently. Trust itself was shaped by predictability. People were known for how they behaved day after day, not for isolated acts. Reputation formed gradually, rooted in reliability rather than impression. This slow formation reduced suspicion. One assumed good intent, unless experience suggested otherwise. The rhythm of obligations reflected this trust. Appointments were honored without reminders. Promises were remembered because they were few and deliberate. To give one's word carried weight. Breaking it required explanation, not because of formal consequence, but because it disrupted an understood order. Time spent together was not measured by productivity. Sitting in the same space, sharing silence or routine conversation, was considered valuable in itself. Presence did not need to be justified by outcome. Relationships were sustained by continuity rather than constant affirmation. Children learned this naturally. They absorbed patterns by observing adults move through their days. They learned when effort was expected and when rest was permitted. They noticed how problems were approached calmly, how solutions emerged through patience. These lessons were not framed as guidance. They were simply lived. Play reflected the same principles. Games unfolded without strict rules, adapting participants and circumstances. Disputes were resolved informally, often through negotiation rather than enforcement. This flexibility fostered cooperation and resilience, teaching children how to navigate shared space. The absence of constant oversight encouraged responsibility. Children were trusted with tasks appropriate to their abilities. This trust built confidence. Mistakes were treated as part of learning, corrected gently rather than punished harshly. Accountability grew from experience rather than fear. Adults, too, operated within a framework of mutual expectation. One did not need to explain every action or justify every choice. Autonomy was respected, balanced by awareness of others. This equilibrium reduced friction and allowed individuality to coexist with community. Workplace relationships mirrored this balance. Hierarchies existed, but they were tempered by familiarity. Authority was exercised quietly, often through example. Guidance was offered when needed, withheld when not. Respect flowed both ways, shaped by shared experience. The pace of professional life allowed for mastery. Skills developed through repetition, refined over years rather than rushed. Competence was recognized through consistency. One became known for what one did well, not for how quickly one advanced. Pride in work was internal. Satisfaction came from knowing a task had been completed properly. External validation was welcome but not essential. This internal measure reduced competition and fostered collaboration. Success was shared rather than contested. The relationship with failure was similarly moderated. Setbacks were acknowledged without dramatization. They were absorbed into experience, informing future decisions. This approach reduced fear and encouraged persistence. One learned to continue despite imperfection. Public discourse reflected restraint. Opinions were expressed thoughtfully, often prefaced by acknowledgement of uncertainty. Listening was valued as much as speaking. Disagreement did not require confrontation. It could exist quietly, held alongside respect. Media consumption followed similar patterns. Information was received at measured pace, allowing time for reflection. Sensationalism was limited by structure rather than restraint. The absence of constant updates encouraged deeper engagement with what was known. The act of reading, whether news or literature, was immersive. One engaged fully, undistracted by parallel activity. This focus allowed ideas to settle and connections to form. Reading shaped thought gradually, influencing perspective over time. The physical act of writing reinforced deliberation. Notes were taken sparingly. Lists were short. Words were chosen with care. Writing slowed thinking, encouraging clarity and intention. This discipline extended beyond communication into decision-making. Decision-making itself was often communal. Choices affecting others were discussed openly, weighed collectively. Consensus was sought, though not always achieved. The process mattered as much as the outcome. Participation fostered acceptance. The environment in which these decisions occurred supported calm. Spaces were not crowded with stimuli. Visual simplicity allowed attention to rest. Sound levels were moderate, conversations clear. This sensory moderation reduced fatigue and supported focus. Even celebrations reflected restraint. Joy was expressed without excess. Gatherings were lively but not overwhelming. Music, conversation, and food combined to create warmth rather than spectacle. The emphasis remained on shared experience. The conclusion of such gatherings was unhurried. People lingered, conversations winding down gradually. Departures were marked by proper farewells, acknowledging the shared time. Closure mattered, reinforcing the sense of completion. The transition from activity to rest was smooth. Evenings settled gently, guided by diminishing light and natural fatigue. There was no struggle to disengage. Rest followed activity organically, restoring balance. Nighttime carried its own quiet significance. It marked not just the end of the day, but a pause within the larger flow of time. Sleep was a surrender to continuity, trusting that morning would arrive as it always had. This trust extended beyond sleep into life itself. One trusted that routines would hold, that community would support, that effort would yield outcome over time. This trust reduced anxiety and allowed attention to remain present. As years accumulated, these patterns formed a stable foundation. Individuals carried them forward, adapting them to new circumstances. Even when environments changed, the underlying approach to time and attention persisted. This persistence explains why memories of those days remain vivid. They were lived fully, not because they were extraordinary, but because they were coherent. Each day connected naturally to the next, forming a narrative that felt complete. In reflecting now, we recognize that coherence as a form of richness. Life did not need to be constantly stimulating to be meaningful. Depth emerged from engagement rather than novelty. Satisfaction arose from continuity rather than accumulation. The sense of enough permeated this way of living. Enough interaction, enough work, enough rest. This balance prevented exhaustion and fostered contentment. One did not constantly seek more, because what existed was sufficient. As the world evolved, this sense of sufficiency became harder to maintain. Yet its memory remains, offering a quiet counterpoint to acceleration. It reminds us that value can reside in what endures, in what repeats, in what unfolds slowly. This remembrance does not impose itself. It simply exists, informing perspective subtly. It suggests that simplicity is not emptiness, but clarity. That restraint can reveal depth. That patience can cultivate meaning. As the reflection continues, it honors this understanding without insisting upon it. It acknowledges change while preserving memory. It recognizes that the past cannot be recreated, but its lessons can be carried forward. The idea that a day could be enough rests at the heart of this remembrance. Enough not because nothing more was possible, but because nothing more was required. Living attentively within limits provided fulfillment. This idea endures because it speaks to a universal experience. The desire to feel complete within the passing of time. To end a day without regret or restlessness. To sense that one has participated fully in the hours given. And so the reflection moves on, steady and composed, holding this insight gently. It continues to explore how such a rhythm shaped lives quietly, leaving traces that persist even now, guiding perception, and offering calm amid change. As the reflection unfolds further, attention turns toward the quiet ways in which continuity fosters a sense of belonging that required little affirmation. Belonging was not asserted or questioned. It was assumed. One belonged to a place, to a routine, to a network of familiar faces, simply by participating in daily life. There was no need to define identity constantly, because identity was reinforced through repeated presence. This sense of belonging was strengthened by the stability of roles. People knew what was expected of them, not because expectations were rigid, but because they were consistent. A neighbor remained a neighbor, a shopkeeper a shopkeeper, a colleague. These roles were not limiting. They provided orientation. Knowing how to relate to others reduced uncertainty and eased interaction. Within this structure, individuality found space quietly. Differences in temperament, preference, and habit were observed and accepted without emphasis. One did not need to stand out to be recognized. Distinctiveness emerged naturally over time, shaped by behavior rather than declaration. This allowed people to be themselves without constant explanation. The pace of life supported reflection without requiring it. One did not feel compelled to analyze experience continually. Thoughts were allowed to surface and settle at their own rhythm. Understanding often arrived later, during moments of rest or repetition. Insight was not pursued aggressively. It emerged through familiarity. This approach extended to learning. Skills were acquired gradually, reinforced through practice rather than accelerated instruction. One learned by doing, observing, and repeating. Progress was steady, rarely dramatic. Mastery was recognized through ease rather than display. The absence of constant feedback allowed confidence to develop internally. One did not rely on external validation to gauge progress. Satisfaction came from competence felt rather than approval received. This internal measure fostered resilience and reduced comparison. Social gatherings reflected this inward orientation. Participation was genuine, unmediated by self-consciousness. People spoke as they thought, listened as they could, and allowed conversation to unfold without direction. The lack of performance allowed authenticity to surface. Hospitality was practiced simply. Guests were welcomed without ceremony, offered what was available rather than what was impressive. The emphasis was on comfort rather than presentation. This simplicity reinforced connection, reminding everyone that presence mattered more than arrangement. Shared activities strengthened bonds without requiring coordination, working together on ordinary tasks. Preparing a meal, cleaning a space, repairing something, created connection through cooperation. Conversation flowed alongside effort, unforced and natural. The division between private and public life was respected. One did not feel compelled to share every thought or experience. Privacy was not secrecy, it was space. This space allowed individuals to process experiences internally before offering them outwardly. Emotional expression followed this pattern. Feelings were acknowledged through behavior rather than articulation. Care was shown through action. Support was offered through presence. Words were used when necessary, not reflexively. This restraint did not suppress emotion. It grounded it. Joy was expressed through shared moments rather than announcements. Sorrow was held quietly, supported by routine and familiarity. Emotional life was integrated into daily rhythms rather than separated from them. The passage of time reinforced these patterns. As years accumulated, routines deepened rather than stagnated. Familiar activities gained nuance. Relationships acquired layers of shared experience. Memory intertwined with habit, creating continuity. This continuity shaped expectations about change. Change was anticipated as gradual, not disruptive. One adjusted slowly, carrying familiar elements forward. Even significant transitions were approached incrementally, reducing disorientation. The experience of aging was shaped by this gradualism. Changes in ability or role were noticed gently, accommodated without alarm. One adapted routines to fit new circumstances. Identity shifted subtly, retaining continuity even as specifics evolved. The community absorbed these shifts collectively. Elders remained visible and engaged. Younger individuals assumed responsibility gradually. Knowledge and experience circulated naturally, passed through observation and shared activity rather than formal transfer. The environment mirrored this continuity. Buildings aged visibly, bearing marks of time without shame. Where was accepted as evidence of use rather than decline. Repair preserved function without erasing history. The relationship with objects reflected respect for time invested. Items were valued for their service rather than novelty. Replacement was considered carefully. This approach extended beyond material goods into habits and relationships. Decision-making reflected patience. Choices were weighed slowly, considering long-term implications rather than immediate gratification. The future was approached with caution and hope rather than urgency. This balance fostered stability. The rhythm of the week reinforced structure without rigidity. Certain days carried specific expectations, guiding activity naturally. Weekends offered rest without excess. Transitions between work and rest were clear, allowing recovery. This clarity reduced mental load. One did not need to negotiate constantly between competing demands. Priorities were understood, reducing internal conflict. Energy could be directed toward participation rather than management. The absence of constant choice simplified life. With fewer options, decisions were easier. One committed to what was available and invested attention there. This focus enhanced satisfaction. As we reflect now, we see how these conditions nurtured presence. People lived within their days rather than above them. Attention was anchored in immediate experience. This grounding fostered a sense of sufficiency. The idea of progress existed, but it did not dominate consciousness. Improvement occurred through refinement rather than reinvention. One built upon what existed rather than discarding it. This continuity preserved meaning. Memory of these patterns persists because they offered coherence. Life felt navigable. One understood how to move through it without constant recalibration. This understanding reduced anxiety and fostered calm. In recalling this now, we do not seek to idealize or replicate it exactly. We acknowledge its context and limitations. Yet we recognize that its approach to time and attention offered something enduring. It reminds us that fulfillment can arise from alignment rather than expansion, that living attentively within known rhythms can produce satisfaction, that simplicity, when supported by continuity, can feel rich. As the reflection continues, it carries this insight forward gently. It does not argue or instruct. It simply observes how meaning once emerged quietly from repetition, from familiarity, from shared understanding. This observation invites consideration without demand. It suggests that beneath the complexity of modern life, the essence of sufficient day remains accessible. That presence, patience, and continuity still offer grounding. The memory of those days remains not as nostalgia alone, but as perspective. It offers a way of seeing time not as something to be filled, but as something to be lived. It reminds us that a day does not need to be extraordinary to be complete. And so the reflection moves onward, steady and composed, honoring the quiet inheritance of those rhythms. It continues to explore how a simple day could once be enough, and how that understanding still resonates within us, shaping how we sense time, presence, and meaning. As the reflection deepens further, attention turns toward how continuity offered not only stability, but orientation. In those years, people rarely felt lost within their own lives. There was a sense of direction that did not rely on constant planning. One moved forward because there was a path, visible through repetition and familiarity. Even when uncertainty arose, it existed within known boundaries. This orientation was reinforced by the predictability of beginnings and endings. Days began and concluded in recognizable ways. Morning routines signaled entry into the day, while evening rituals marked its close. These transitions framed experience gently, preventing days from blending indistinctly into one another. Each day stood on its own, complete within its limits. The act of beginning carried calm rather than anticipation. One did not wake expecting disruption or novelty. Instead, one expected continuity. This expectation reduced anxiety and allowed attention to settle into the present. The day was approached not as a challenge to overcome, but as a space to inhabit. Similarly, endings were accepted without resistance. Nightfall was not postponed unnecessarily. The conclusion of the day did not provoke regret or urgency. What remained unfinished could wait. Sleep was a form of trust, an acknowledgement that continuity would resume with morning. This trust extended into longer spans of time. Weeks and months unfolded with recognizable patterns. Seasonal shifts brought gradual change rather than abrupt disruption. One adapted routines accordingly, without feeling displaced. This gradualism preserved equilibrium. The absence of constant urgency shaped decision-making. Choices were made with consideration rather than speed. One evaluated options calmly, guided by experience rather than impulse. The consequences of decisions were accepted as part of life, not as failures of judgment. Mistakes were integrated into narrative rather than isolated. They became chapters within a larger story, informing future actions without defining identity. This perspective fostered forgiveness, both toward oneself and others. The way people spoke about the past reflected this integration. Memories were shared without dramatization. Experiences were recounted matter-of-factly, allowing listeners to draw their own meaning. This restraint preserved dignity and avoided exaggeration. Shared memory played a significant role in reinforcing continuity. Collective recollection created a sense of lineage. Stories were told not to impress, but to connect. They situated individuals within a broader context, linking personal experience to shared history. These stories often focus on ordinary events rather than milestones. A long walk, a shared meal, a familiar routine. Such moments gained significance through repetition. They reminded listeners that meaning could be found in daily life. The physical environment supported this narrative continuity. Streets, buildings, and landscapes remained familiar over time. Changes occurred slowly enough to be absorbed without disorientation. One recognized places even as they evolved, preserving a sense of belonging. This familiarity fostered care. People treated shared spaces with respect, recognizing their role in collective life. Maintenance was seen as responsibility rather than burden. Care extended beyond ownership into stewardship. The relationship between effort and reward was understood intuitively. Results followed work gradually. Immediate gratification was rare, but satisfaction was deeper. One learned to value process over outcome, patience over speed. This understanding influenced how people approached challenges. Difficult tasks were broken into manageable steps. Persistence mattered more than brilliance. Progress was measured by consistency rather than acceleration. Social bonds reflected the same patience. Relationships were allowed to develop naturally, without pressure to define them quickly. Trust grew through shared experience. Loyalty was earned through reliability rather than declaration. Conflict, when it arose, was contextualized within these bonds. Disagreements did not erase history. They were absorbed into the relationship, tempered by familiarity and mutual respect. Resolution was often implicit rather than formal. Public behavior reinforced shared norms quietly. People adjusted actions based on context, without explicit rules. Courtesy was practiced instinctively. These small adjustments smoothed interaction and reduced friction. The absence of constant comparison reduced competition. People measure themselves against personal standards rather than external benchmarks. Success was defined internally, informed by values rather than visibility. This internal orientation fostered contentment. One did not constantly assess whether life measured up to external expectations. Satisfaction arose from alignment with one's own sense of purpose. Purpose itself was modest. It centered on participation rather than achievement, contributing to shared life, maintaining relationships, fulfilling responsibilities. These were sufficient aims. Grand narratives were unnecessary. The rhythm of work and rest supported this modest purpose. Effort was balanced by recovery. Neither dominated entirely. This balance preserved health and prevented burnout. Even if the term was not used, leisure was integrated into life seamlessly. Moments of rest appeared naturally between tasks. One did not schedule relaxation. It emerged from rhythm. This integration allowed for genuine rest rather than forced downtime. The relationship with technology, limited as it was, reflected restraint. Tools were used when needed, set aside when not. They did not demand attention continuously. This allowed individuals to remain anchored in physical experience. Attention itself was treated as finite. One did not attempt to divide it endlessly. Focus was given to one thing at a time. This singular attention enhanced engagement and reduced mental strain. The passage of time felt tangible. Days left impressions rather than data. Memory retained atmosphere and feeling. This qualitative experience of time enriched recollection, allowing meaning to surface gradually. As years passed, individuals carried these impressions with them. Even as environments changed, the underlying approach to time and attention persisted. It influenced how many navigated later complexity. This persistence explains the enduring resonance of that era. It offered not perfection, but coherence. Life made sense within its boundaries. One understood how to live within time, without constantly negotiating its demands. In reflecting now, we recognize that coherence as a form of wealth. It reduced anxiety, fostered connection, and allowed presence. It did not eliminate difficulty, but it contextualized it. The idea that a day could be enough rests upon this coherence. Enough not because it lacked ambition, but because it honored limits. Enough because it balanced effort and rest, engagement and withdrawal. This idea remains compelling because it addresses a fundamental human need: to feel oriented within time, to know where one stands, what one is doing, and why it matters. As the reflection continues, it does not propose solutions. It observes patterns and their effects. It acknowledges that circumstances have changed, but that underlying needs remain. The memory of those days offers perspective rather than prescription. It suggests that meaning can arise from continuity, from familiarity, from repetition embraced rather than resisted. It reminds us that simplicity does not imply emptiness. It can create space for depth. That restraint can cultivate richness. That patience can support fulfillment. As we move forward in this reflection, these insights accumulate quietly. They form a backdrop against which the present can be viewed with greater clarity. Not to judge, but to understand. The recollection continues to unfold, steady and composed, honoring the subtle ways in which time once shaped daily life gently. It carries forward the understanding that a simple day, lived attentively within known rhythms, could stand complete. And within that understanding lies a quiet assurance that even as the world changes, the essence of sufficient day remains accessible, waiting to be recognized anew. As the reflection moves onward, attention settles on how continuity shaped not only days, but character. Over time, habits became dispositions. The way one approached a morning, a conversation, a task, gradually formed an outlook on life itself. Patience was not learned deliberately. It emerged from waiting. Care was not taught explicitly. It developed through repetition. Responsibility grew from being relied upon, not from instruction. This slow formation of character was rarely noticed while it was happening. It revealed itself later in how individuals responded to change, to difficulty, to uncertainty. When challenges appeared, there was often an instinct to steady rather than to rush. One paused before reacting, trusted familiar processes, and allowed solutions to emerge gradually. This composure was not dramatic, but it was effective. The sense of proportion that developed during those years was especially significant. Problems were evaluated within context. Few things were treated as absolute emergencies. Perspective softened reaction. One distinguished between what required immediate attention and what could wait. This discernment reduced unnecessary strain. Daily responsibilities reinforced this sense of proportion. Tasks were completed because they needed to be done, not because they carried symbolic weight. Folding laundry, sweeping a floor, preparing a meal, these actions did not define identity, yet they contributed to stability. Their modesty kept life grounded. There was also an acceptance that not everything needed improvement. Some things were sufficient as they were. This acceptance did not discourage progress. It prevented restlessness. Change occurred when necessary, not because of dissatisfaction alone. Contentment was allowed to coexist with ambition. This balance influenced relationships profoundly. People did not expect others to fulfill every need. Connection was valued, but independence was respected. Space within relationships was natural, allowing bonds to breathe. This reduced pressure and fostered longevity. Communication reflected this respect for space. Silence between exchanges did not signal disinterest. It indicated trust. One did not need constant reassurance to feel connected. Absence did not threaten belonging. Reunion restored closeness easily. The way people handled disagreement reflected this maturity. Differences were acknowledged without escalation. One could disagree and still cooperate. This ability preserved social harmony without suppressing individuality. Public life benefited from this restraint. Civility was maintained not through enforcement, but through shared understanding. People moderated themselves out of respect for others. This self-regulation created a smoother collective experience. The rhythm of shared spaces reflected mutual consideration. Noise was moderated naturally. Movement adjusted to accommodate others. Courtesy was practiced instinctively, reducing friction and fostering calm. This calm extended into moments of uncertainty. When outcomes were unclear, people waited rather than speculated excessively. Trust in process replaced anxiety. One accepted that not everything could be controlled or known immediately. The absence of constant prediction allowed presence. One focused on what was happening rather than what might happen. This grounding reduced mental fatigue and enhanced engagement with immediate experience. The physical act of living reinforced this grounding. Activities involved the body fully. Walking, lifting, cleaning, repairing. These actions connected individuals to their environment. Physical engagement anchored attention in the present. Even leisure involved participation rather than consumption. Games require interaction. Reading demanded focus. Music invited listening rather than background noise. These activities engaged the mind without overwhelming it. The boundaries between different parts of life were clearer. Work ended, rest began. Public and private spaces were distinct. This separation allowed recovery and preserved energy. One did not carry every role everywhere. This clarity contributed to a sense of completion at the end of the day. One could reflect briefly and then release the hours past. Sleep arrived without lingering tension. The body and mind rested together. Over time, these daily completions accumulated into a life that felt coherent. One could look back and recognize patterns, growth, continuity. Life made sense not because it followed a plan, but because it followed a rhythm. As we reflect now, we see how this rhythm fostered resilience. People were not insulated from difficulty, but they were equipped to endure it. Familiar structures provided support. One knew how to continue, even when circumstances shifted. This resilience did not require optimism. It was rooted in realism. One accepted limits, adjusted expectations, and persisted. Hope existed quietly, grounded in experience rather than promise. The way people spoke about the future reflected this grounded hope. Plans were made cautiously. Expectations were tempered. The future was approached as an extension of the present, not a radical departure from it. This continuity reduced fear. Change was anticipated as gradual rather than disruptive. Even significant transitions were integrated into existing patterns. One adapted without losing orientation. The memory of this adaptability remains powerful. It suggests that stability does not depend on sameness, but on continuity of approach, that one can change environments while retaining inner rhythm. As years passed and the world accelerated, many carried this rhythm within them. It influenced how they responded to new demands. It offered a reference point for balance. This reference point does not reject progress. It contextualizes it. It reminds us that advancement need not abandon presence, that innovation can coexist with restraint. The idea that a day could be enough emerges again here, not as nostalgia, but as principle. Enough time to attend, to contribute, to rest. Enough engagement to feel present. Enough closure to release the day. This principle challenges the assumption that more is always better. It suggests that sufficiency can be satisfying, that completeness does not require excess. As the reflection continues, it honors this principle quietly. It observes how a slower rhythm allowed life to settle into itself, how meaning emerged from alignment rather than accumulation. It also acknowledges that such a rhythm required conditions that no longer exist in the same way. The world has changed, and with it, the structure of daily life. Yet the memory persists because it speaks to enduring human needs. These needs remain: orientation, presence, balance, continuity. They are not tied to a specific era. They can be met in different forms. The recollection of the 1960s offers one example of how they were met. It provides insight into how daily life once supported them naturally. As we carry this insight forward, it does not instruct us to return. It invites us to recognize what was valuable and why, to understand how rhythm shapes experience. The reflection moves onward, steady and thoughtful, weaving these observations together. It continues to explore how a simple day, shaped by continuity and care, could foster a sense of completeness that still resonates. And within that resonance lies a quiet question, not asked aloud. How might we inhabit time now, informed by this memory, without resisting change, yet without losing ourselves to urgency? The reflection does not answer this question directly. It allows it to remain open, trusting that awareness itself is valuable. As the narrative proceeds, it maintains its calm, observing without judgment, honoring without idealization. It continues to trace how life once moved at a pace that allowed attention to settle, and how that settling created meaning. The understanding grows gradually, layer by layer, much like the days it describes. It reinforces the idea that fulfillment can arise from coherence, that presence can be cultivated through rhythm, that a day lived attentively can indeed be enough. And so the reflection continues, carrying forward this quiet wisdom, preparing to explore further how time, memory, and daily life intertwine, shaping not only how we live, but how we remember living. As the reflection approaches its later movements, attention begins to settle on how memory itself has been shaped by that earlier rhythm of life. What we remember most clearly is rarely a specific date or event, but an atmosphere, a way of moving through hours without resistance, a sense of being held by time rather than chased by it. These impressions endure because they were formed slowly, reinforced daily, and allowed to take root without interruption. Memory in those years did not depend on constant reinforcement. Experiences were not immediately revisited or documented. They were allowed to fade naturally, leaving behind what mattered most. What remained was not detail, but meaning. This process gave memory depth rather than breadth. It preserved feeling over precision. Because of this, recollection often arrives unexpectedly. A sound, a smell, a familiar gesture can reopen an entire landscape of experience. These moments remind us that memory is not stored neatly. It lives within us, layered and responsive. It connects present sensation with past rhythms seamlessly. The way people spoke about earlier times reflected this relationship with memory. Recollections were offered quietly, often without emphasis. Stories were told not to impress, but to share continuity. They connected generations by placing individual experience within a longer flow of time. These stories rarely focused on achievement. They centered on moments of ordinary life. Work done steadily, days passed calmly, relationships maintained over years. The absence of dramatic framing allowed listeners to recognize themselves within the narrative. This recognition fostered belonging across time. One felt part of a continuum rather than an isolated moment. Life was understood as something inherited and passed on, shaped by those who came before and influencing those who followed. The sense of inheritance extended beyond material things. It included habits, attitudes, and expectations. The way one greeted others, approached work, handled disappointment, or accepted change often reflected patterns absorbed early and carried forward unconsciously. These patterns provided guidance during periods of transition. When life became more complex, when demands increased, when the pace accelerated, many found themselves returning instinctively to earlier habits, pausing before reacting, finishing one thing before beginning another, allowing rest to follow effort. Even when circumstances no longer supported such rhythms, the memory of them offered orientation. It reminded individuals that another way of living had once existed, and that elements of it could still be reclaimed internally. This internal reclamation often appeared in small acts, choosing to sit quietly rather than fill every moment, completing a task with care rather than haste, allowing a day to end without revisiting it repeatedly. These choices reflected an enduring sensibility rather than deliberate resistance. The sense of dignity that characterized earlier daily life also persisted in memory. Dignity was not expressed through status or display, but through comportment, through how one carried oneself, treated others, and accepted circumstance. This dignity did not seek recognition. It simply existed. Respect for oneself and others formed a quiet ethical framework. It did not rely on formal rules or declarations. It emerged through behavior observed consistently. Courtesy, patience, and restraint were practiced not as virtues to be showcased, but as norms to be upheld. This ethical framework supported social cohesion. People trusted one another to behave reasonably. When expectations were met, they required no comment. When they were not, correction was often gentle and indirect. The goal was restoration rather than punishment. The absence of constant evaluation reduced defensiveness. Individuals did not feel under continuous scrutiny. This allowed authenticity to surface. People acted according to their understanding rather than their image. The relationship between individual and collective life was balanced. One did not feel swallowed by the group nor isolated within it. Participation was expected but not enforced. Withdrawal was permitted without suspicion. This balance preserved autonomy and connection simultaneously. Public spaces reflected this equilibrium. They were shared respectfully, without constant negotiation. One adjusted behavior intuitively, guided by awareness of others. This mutual adjustment reduced friction and fostered ease. The rhythm of civic life reinforced patience. Processes took time, and that time was accepted. Waiting was not framed as inefficiency, but as part of functioning together. This acceptance reduced frustration and encouraged cooperation. The absence of constant urgency allowed deeper engagement with place. People noticed changes slowly. A new building, a closed shop, a planted tree. These developments altered the landscape gradually, becoming part of collective memory. This gradual change preserved continuity. Even as environments evolved, they remained recognizable. One could trace personal history through familiar landmarks, connecting past and present spatially. The relationship between time and identity was similarly continuous. One did not feel compelled to redefine oneself constantly. Identity evolved naturally through experience. One became someone over time rather than declaring oneself anew repeatedly. This evolution allowed for stability. One knew who one was because one had lived as oneself consistently. This knowledge reduced anxiety and fostered confidence. Confidence, in this context, was quiet. It did not seek validation. It expressed itself through steadiness, through reliability, through calm response. It was visible in how one handled routine and difficulty alike. The memory of such confidence remains compelling because it contrasts with the volatility of later years. It reminds us that assurance can arise from familiarity rather than control, from participation rather than mastery. As we reflect now, we see how these elements combine to create a life that felt inhabitable. One could live within it without constant adjustment. The day offered space to act, to rest, to relate. The sense that a day could be enough rests upon this inhabitable quality. Enough because it contained rhythm. Enough because it offered closure. Enough because it did not demand more than could be given. This understanding does not deny ambition or growth. It situates them within a broader context. Growth occurred, but it did not overwhelm the present. Ambition existed, but it did not displace contentment. The memory of this balance continues to inform perspective. It provides a reference point for evaluating pace, priority, and presence. It invites reflection rather than reaction. As the reflection continues toward its final movement, it gathers these insights quietly. It does not summarize or conclude prematurely. It allows understanding to deepen gradually, much as it once did in daily life. The narrative remains unhurried, respecting the rhythm it describes. It acknowledges complexity without amplifying it. It honors simplicity without idealizing it. What emerges is not a call to return, but a recognition of continuity, that the essence of sufficient day is not bound to a decade. It resides in how time is inhabited, how attention is given, how limits are accepted. The memory of the 1960s offers one expression of this essence. It shows how daily life once aligned naturally with human scale, how repetition fostered meaning, how restraint preserved depth. As we hold this memory now, it continues to speak softly. It reminds us that fulfillment need not be loud, that presence can be cultivated quietly, that a day lived attentively can still stand complete. The reflection moves gently onward, preparing to settle into its final consideration. It carries with it the accumulated weight of observation, memory, and insight. It approaches closure not as an ending, but as a resting place. And within that resting place lies the enduring realization that time, when allowed to move at human pace, can hold us. That life, when lived within its natural rhythm, can feel whole. This realization remains with us, shaping how we remember, how we attend, and how we continue to move through our days. Quietly, steadily, and with the knowledge that enough has always been possible. As a reflection reaches its final movement, it does not rush toward conclusion. Instead, it slows further, as if honoring the very rhythm it has been tracing. What emerges now is not a summary, but settling, a quiet acknowledgement of what has been observed, remembered, and carried forward. The sense that meaning, once formed patiently, does not require reinforcement to endure. In looking back across those years, we recognize that the simplicity we recall was not a lack of substance, but a clarity of scale. Life fit within human attention. Days were sized to what could reasonably be lived, not endlessly expanded by expectation. This proportion allowed individuals to remain present without feeling diminished. Presence itself was not a concept to be practiced. It was a condition created by circumstance and habit. With fewer interruptions, attention rested naturally on what was at hand. One did not need to remind oneself to be attentive. There was little else competing for awareness. This allowed moments to be experienced fully without fragmentation. The idea that a day could be enough arises here not as nostalgia, but as recognition. Enough because the day contained rhythm. Enough because it offered purpose without pressure. Enough because it ended cleanly, leaving room for rest rather than reflection without end. In those days, completion was not measured by output, but by closure. One could sense when something was finished, whether it was a task, a conversation, or the day itself. This sense of completion allowed release. One did not carry the weight of unfinishedness constantly forward. The relationship with time was therefore cooperative rather than adversarial. Time was not something to defeat or control. It was something to move with. This cooperation reduced anxiety and allowed trust to develop, both in oneself and in the unfolding of life. Trust is perhaps the most enduring thread running through this reflection. Trust in routines, in relationships, in continuity. Trust that effort would accumulate meaningfully. Trust that rest was deserved. Trust that tomorrow would arrive without needing to be forced. This trust did not eliminate uncertainty, but it framed it differently. Uncertainty existed within known boundaries. It did not overwhelm daily life. One could acknowledge what was unknown without being consumed by it. This balance preserved emotional steadiness. Steadiness, in turn, shaped character. People learned to respond rather than react, to wait rather than rush, to accept rather than resist unnecessarily. These responses were not heroic. They were practical, formed through daily repetition rather than conscious choice. The dignity that emerged from this steadiness remains one of the most quietly powerful aspects of that era. Dignity expressed itself through restraint, through reliability, through respect for oneself and others. It did not demand recognition. It simply existed, visible in behavior and tone. This dignity extended to how people handled both success and difficulty. Achievement was met with modesty. Hardship was met with endurance rather than display. Life unfolded without constant commentary. Experience spoke for itself. In remembering this now, we are not ignoring the imperfections of the past. We acknowledge them fully. Yet we recognize that within those imperfections, there existed a coherence that is often missing today. A coherence that allowed individuals to feel at home within their lives. Feeling at home within one's life is perhaps the quietest, yet most profound form of contentment. It does not require excitement or validation. It arises when daily actions align with inner understanding. When life makes sense at a human scale, the memory of such alignment continues to resonate because it addresses a fundamental longing, the desire for wholeness without excess, to live fully without being overwhelmed, to feel complete without constant accumulation. This longing is not bound to a particular generation. It surfaces whenever life accelerates beyond comprehension. It reminds us that human attention has limits, and that honoring those limits can be a source of strength rather than weakness. The reflection of the 1960s offers one example of how those limits were once respected almost instinctively, not through doctrine or design, but through habit and circumstance. Life moved at a pace that allowed understanding to keep up. Understanding itself was not hurried. People learned through repetition, through observation, through time. Knowledge deepened slowly, integrating into identity rather than remaining external. This depth fostered confidence that did not depend on novelty. As the world changed, many carried this depth with them. It became a quiet anchor. Even when daily life no longer supported such rhythms, the memory of them offered orientation. It reminded individuals that another way of inhabiting time was possible. This possibility does not demand imitation. It invites awareness. It asks us to notice how pace shapes experience, how repetition fosters meaning, how restraint preserves attention. It encourages reflection without prescription. In this sense, the memory becomes a legacy rather than a blueprint. It offers insight into human needs that persist across eras. Needs for rhythm, for closure, for presence, for trust. The legacy is subtle. It does not announce itself. It appears in preferences, in instincts, in the quiet satisfaction felt when a day ends cleanly. It appears in the desire to slow, to focus, to simplify, not as retreat but as recalibration. Recalibration does not require rejecting the present. It involves adjusting one's relationship to it, recognizing when acceleration exceeds capacity, allowing oneself to pause without guilt, valuing attention as a finite and precious resource. The reflection does not suggest that simplicity alone creates meaning. It suggests that simplicity creates space. Space for thought, for connection, for rest. Space in which meaning can emerge naturally. This space was abundant in those earlier days, not because life was empty, but because it was proportioned. Each element had room to exist without crowding others. Work, rest, relationship, solitude, all had their place. As we stand now at the end of this reflection, what remains is not instruction, but recognition. Recognition that the feeling of enough is possible, that it once existed not as an ideal, but as a lived reality for many. This recognition does not diminish the present. It enriches it by offering perspective. It reminds us that fulfillment is not synonymous with intensity, that quiet days can be complete, that ordinary moments can carry depth. The memory of a simple day being enough endures because it speaks to this truth. It reminds us that life does not need to be constantly justified, that presence itself can be sufficient. As the reflection settles, it does so gently without finality. It leaves space for the reader to continue thinking, remembering, sensing. It honors silence as part of understanding. What remains is a calm awareness. That time, when allowed to move at a human pace, can hold meaning without force. That days, when lived attentively within their limits, can stand whole. This awareness does not belong to the past alone. It belongs to anyone willing to notice it. It exists quietly, beneath urgency, beneath noise, waiting to be recognized. And so the reflection concludes not with an answer, but with a feeling, a sense of steadiness, a sense of proportion, a sense that, once upon a time, a simple day was enough, and that this truth, though often obscured, has never entirely left us.